Once a distant prospect, global warming has become a reality that all political parties in Norway can no longer ignore. In the recent election, Norway's ruling Conservative Party lost to the Labour Party and its allies, and a centre-left government is soon to take over. Significantly, the single most debated issue in the run-up to the vote was that of climate change. Hello there, welcome to Roundtable. Norway's left-wing opposition won the election by a landslide. The campaign was dominated by the future of its oil industry. And the question remains, can the country move away from an oil-based economy? Norway has been a leading proponent of green energy, embracing environmentally friendly policies such as electric cars and renewable energy sources. An Ipsos survey found that 57% of Norwegians agreed that being environmentally friendly is an important part of being Norwegian. But over the years, Norway's black gold, oil and gas, has financed a generous welfare state. The Norwegian oil sector accounts for 14% of gross domestic product, as well as 40% of its exports, and 200,000 direct jobs. Arild Hernstad of Norway's Green Party says it's definitely hypocritical. If you want to invest in renewables, you have to invest in renewables and not invest in more oil in order to do some transition in the future, because we don't have time for that. Pressure's mounting as the Scandinavian country has also pledged to become carbon neutral by 2030. With a new Labour-led government, can Western Europe's biggest oil producer find the solution to its climate paradox? Joining us on Roundtable today in Bergen, Norway, is Lars-Henrik Michelsen, Director of the Norwegian Climate Foundation. In Trondheim, in Norway, we have Espen Moe, Professor of Political Science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And in Paris, we have Havard Halland, a senior economist at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Lars-Henrik, let me start with you, because there does seem to be this dichotomy in Norway, isn't there, that it's embraced renewable energy, yet at the same time, it's expanding its oil and gas exploration. Are you expecting that to change under the new government?
Yeah. Right now, there are three parties that have, they have started pre-negotiations. And one of them, the Socialist Party, they must get a big win if they are to join the government formally. And they have been running a campaign where climate change and another oil and gas policy has been one of the main topics. So yes, I expect there will be some changes to how Norway acts as an oil and gas nation in the future.
Espen, do you agree with that? Because Norway's income has been built off the back of oil and gas exploration.
I think I'm slightly more skeptical, and that is, we knew for a long while that there would be a change in government. We knew for a long while that the two major parties in the new government coalition would be the Labour Party and the Centre Party. These parties are as much petroleum parties as the Conservatives. And then you have to give the socialist left some concessions. But the government already offered some concessions before the election in terms of changes to the taxation regime in the North Sea. And my gut feeling will be that the Labour Party will go with this, add some bits and pieces, but stay fairly well within that same regime. So some things will change and most things will stay the same. OK, so you're less certain that things are going to change significantly.
Harvard, what's your view? Because there's a lot of pressure on Norway to make changes, but it does have this huge sovereign wealth fund, which is built on income from the oil and gas industry. Is it ready to move away from that?
I think the most important thing that Norway can do, that the new government can do, is outside Norway. It's in investments by the sovereign wealth fund outside the country. And the incoming Prime Minister has committed to a net zero objective for the Sovereign Wealth Fund by 2050, and he is also committed to aligning the activities of the fund with Norwegian climate commitments. So this is actually huge, because the fund is actually 3 times as big as the Norwegian economy as a gross domestic product, and emissions from the fund, the fund's portfolio carbon footprint are twice as big as Norwegian national emissions. So this is the biggest single action that the new government can take to align Norwegian economy with climate, and it's often underestimated because under international climate agreements, foreign assets are not counted towards emissions objectives. And therefore, sovereign wealth funds have been flying largely under the radar in this respect. So yes, there will be if the government follows through on this commitment, there will be a significant change.
Yeah, that's a really important point you've raised there, Havard, because there is criticism in the way Norway counts its emissions because it doesn't count emissions caused by its exports, only the emissions created within its borders. And Arild Hernstad of the Green Party has said about that, if everyone here lives in a zero-emission city and at the same time works in the oil industry and exports a lot of carbon dioxide, that's kind of ridiculous. Lars-Henrik, do you agree that the way Norway measures emissions is actually misleading?
One can say, on one hand, this is we are doing the right way. This is how it works internationally. Everyone is responsible for the emissions within their own borders. But as it was pointed out, we have one of the world's biggest sovereign wealth funds, the Norwegian Oil Fund. And it has withdrawn from coal. Now we are saying that we should only invest in companies that set targets, zero emission targets. But at the same time, we cannot continue as we have done so far by pumping up oil and gas from the North Sea and demanding that everyone else should change their behavior. So I think this is backfiring on us as well. And we experience now that more and more newspapers, countries, programs like this, they're asking questions. Yeah, what about yourself? What about your own oil and gas industry? And this is having a major effect on the Norwegian politicians, I believe, also from the 2 main parties, Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And I would say that we are seeing changes in how they are addressing oil and gas now compared to what was the reality a few years ago.
But what's your view, Espen? Is Norway being criticised more and more for the amount of CO2 it's exporting as opposed to what it's actually doing within its own national borders?
I'd like to actually tag straight on to what Lars just said. The present government, the outgoing government, was criticized slightly by people saying, well, it's the fact that you're putting through this this taxation reform of the oil sector 1 week before the election, that shows that you're not really serious. If you'd been serious, you would have done it a month before, or half a year before, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that this is significant, especially since it comes from a conservative government, in the sense that if this had been 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, or 12 years ago, this would have happened 1 week after the election in order not to lose votes. Now it comes 1 week before the election in order not to lose votes. And that says something about a rhetorical change that is going on. And a change in terms of norms. You mean
public sentiment is also changing?
Exactly. At the same time, we shouldn't exaggerate this as well. So, for instance, the Green Party did not make the threshold, the 4% threshold. So it's not obvious that this has been a climate election. And the mainstream media in Oslo may have misjudged. They've told us for several months that this would be a climate election. And it could easily be that they have misjudged the temper in the rest of the country. I mean, we have to wait for the final analysis from election researchers to find this out. But I have a feeling, this is my suspicion, that the Green Party, by going all out, by making oil into a black and white question, or black and green question, contributed to polarizing a bit the Norwegian debate on this. So it became sort of identity politics like either you're one of the good ones or you're one of the bad ones. And if you sided with the oil industry, if you were one of those people, you would say that, well, this is how the welfare state is built, this is how the economy works. And if you're against this, you're a naive moralist, an idealist who doesn't really understand how the world works. So there are several sides to this. I think actually the Green Party may have shot itself a little bit in the foot and done their cause a bit of a disservice by being so black and white, or black and green rather, on this issue.
I mean, a lot of these issues do become black and white, though, don't they? And particularly climate change, which is one of the leading issue of the 21st century. Harvard, I just want to go back to the issue of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because I know that you were instrumental in setting up the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. I hope I've said that right. Basically, this is a commitment from investors to transition their portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So should Norway's sovereign fund be part of something like that?
Firstly, there are lots of initiatives, investor initiatives out there. The Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is an initiative that commits the members to net zero portfolio carbon footprints by 2050, and to having intermediate targets along the way. And there are still no sovereign funds in this initiative, which has nearly $6.7 trillion represented by their members. And so it's important for the capital that the Norwegian fund itself holds to be committed to net zero and to be invested in sectors and companies that are transitioning to net zero. And it's also important because it would be the first big sovereign wealth fund to commit, and hopefully set an example for other countries with sovereign wealth funds to commit to net zero and to the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And I hope that this will be that there will be commitments on this taking place at COP26.
So this is a big initiative. I mean, are we saying that the fund should be able to divest those companies which aren't cutting greenhouse gases enough?
Yes, divestment is part of it, but engagement is arguably far more important, and helping companies to transition to a low carbon economy in all sectors. You're not just talking about fossil fuels. All sectors need to transition and to reduce their emissions, and this means that investor organizations will need to help and to push and to engage with companies in their portfolio to get the emissions down.
Okay, so can I just ask the other two guests what your response to this is? Lars-Henrik, are oil companies themselves doing enough to cut emissions?
No, and the problem is that they are not addressing the main the main business area. That's the problem. They should put more of the investment money into green areas of the economy. But the good news is that what was just being said now, that's happening in Norway. There was a government-initiated expert group recommending just that the fund should invest only in companies that was very clear and had a pathway towards net zero. And the Labour Party, they were saying that this is something they would support if they are to form the new government, which actually is happening now. So I believe that in springtime, this is something that will be accepted by the new government and parliament.
And what's your view, Espen? Are oil companies doing enough?
The obvious answer is always no. We do see that the rhetoric of Equinor has changed. And we do see that new management has changed their rhetoric and their statement about how Equinor will proceed in the future. And we see that the markets are punishing Equinor and other oil companies for not investing in more renewables, whereas, say, 10, 15 years, they were punishing them for investing too much. So there are different expectations, both from markets and coming from within the company. And I think Equinor, more so than most companies, oil companies out there, realize that if they are to be in business in 50 years, they will have had to diversify. And in case of Equinor, the most obvious way of diversifying is floating offshore wind. Are they doing enough? Definitely not. But do they realize that this is the way forward? I think they definitely do.
Do you think it's hypocritical of Norway to call itself a green country and to embrace renewables and to embrace hydropower and electric cars and the like, and yet still continue investing so heavily in oil and gas? What's your view, Havard?
Well, Reuters had a headline a couple of days ago that Norway is pulling out the green air guitar again, which I thought was rather funny. I think the Norwegian economy is, according to some studies, nearly 50% of the economy is somehow linked to oil and gas. So there is a lot of people get their livelihoods from oil and gas, so it's getting a rapid political change is challenging in that sense. On the other hand, there is a willingness to engage on low carbon issues in areas that cost us less, right? Norway's leading on electric cars and so on, and Norway already had very low emissions to start with from the power sector because most of the energy is from hydropower. So is Norway a hypocrite? I think it's a result of our economy. The economy is very oil dependent. People get their livelihoods from it, and at the same time there is a willingness to transition in some areas, and I hope that willingness to transition will expand now to the sovereign fund, and with time, I think also the new government is coming in with a more active industrial policy, which will hopefully help transition the oil and gas industry over to new energy such as floating offshore wind and carbon capture and storage. So it's a result of the economy we have.
Yes, I mean, it is investing in green policies, but this question of continuing to invest so heavily in oil and gas, Espen, what do you say to the accusation that Norway's a bit hypocritical about it all?
I don't really like the term. I obviously understand what you mean. I think that in many ways, Norway and most other countries will continue pumping oil and gas for as long as there is international demand. So in many ways, whether we're hypocritical or not depends on what we do with respect to everything beyond petroleum. So I've said in interviews before that if Equinor is serious, we see that in how much they invest in offshore wind, not in how much they invest in oil and petroleum. And I also think that in many ways, so it's good that we're finally talking about the elephant in the room, the Norwegian petroleum sector. However, the way we talked about this petroleum sector during this election campaign, we also, most political parties conveniently shifted the focus from the other elephant in the room, or what is rapidly becoming the second elephant in the room, which is domestic power production. And there is no topic in Norway, at least in terms of energy and climate, that is fraught with more tension these days than wind power. And especially the environmental parties are completely torn within by themselves between nature protection and renewable energy production. And by switching the focus completely away from domestic power production towards oil and petroleum, we managed to have an entire election campaign where we didn't say almost anything whatsoever about how we were going to increase power production at home, which will be the second big thing. I mean, we have to phase out oil, but we also have to phase out the replacements for oil.
Yeah, there's a lot of elephants in the room. Can I add another elephant in the room, which is how you actually help people, so many thousands employed by the oil and gas industry, how you help them away. We've mentioned how many livelihoods depend on the oil and gas industry. The Norwegian Labour leader says that new industrial policies are required to support companies and people in the climate change transition. This is what he had to say.
Then I would say a more active industrial policy to support industry, small and medium enterprises in tackling the climate change transition. So these two are linked actually. To have a fair policy on climate change policy requires a more active participation from the community, from the state, to support this transition.
Lars-Henrik, let me ask you, it's going to be a lot of work to successfully transition away from an oil and gas industry, particularly when you think about how many jobs are involved in that sector.
Yes, that will be a challenge. And I think most of the politicians now are looking for climate tools that will both reduce emissions and create new jobs. But also, I think that the oil and gas dependency, well, we are more mental dependent on oil and gas than what's the situation in real life. Since the finance crisis, we have lost tens of thousands of jobs in the oil and gas industry, and they've all been absorbed by other sectors of the economy. So,
but both Norway's Conservative and Labour parties have said that oil production should continue past 2050 because they don't want to wreck the economy.
And this is the big paradox, because what we're doing is debating in Norway is, should we open the Arctic for oil and gas activity? And the reality is that it takes 10, 15 years from you start looking for oil, from you find oil resources, till you actually can sell it on the market. And at that time, the world should have become much, much less dependent on oil and gas. So in a way, we are betting that the world we will fail to reach the climate targets. That's the reality.
So can I ask the other guests, what does Norway's economy look like without gas and oil? What do you think, Espen?
At least what we can say is that, in some areas, Norway has done quite a lot to electrify. So, for instance, we're one of the leading countries when it comes to electrifying the ferry sector. And one of the reasons why the ferry sector got sort of an extra push in terms of its electrification plans was that there was a drop in the oil price. In 2014 to 2016, the oil price fell to like $25, $30 per barrel. And that meant that the order books for the oil sectors were suddenly empty, and other sectors needed to come up with other initiatives to stay in business. And that led to, among other things, electrification of ferries. So we most likely need some exogenous shocks here and there. And those exogenous shocks can make politicians, economists, political scientists, others realize that in this area, in this area, in this area, industrial policy, climate policy, and energy policy can be combined. And if you're lucky with these exogenous shocks in different areas, you can have an economy that electrifies a lot faster. So in a few decades, we will need an economy where pretty much everything is electric. And that also means that most likely we'll need to ramp up both hydropower production and wind power production, and not the least offshore wind power production, in addition to obviously energy efficiency measures, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading that neighbouring Denmark has pledged to end fossil fuel exploration and oil production by 2050. Havard, do you think Norway could do the same?
Denmark is in a different situation because their reserves are very mature, so that their economy is not as much affected. New Zealand is also committed to ending exploration and production. And interestingly, these countries, well, Denmark with Costa Rica, have taken the initiative to a beyond oil and gas alliance, which they hope to launch at COP26, as far as I understand, and which I think will be a factor in putting pressure on oil and gas producing countries, including Norway. What will Norway look like after oil and gas? Probably a lot like Denmark, if we manage to capture export markets, and that depends on, among other things, on the industrial policy that the new government is able to put in place. There is a lot of expectation in the Norwegian industry of being able to capture export markets, particularly in floating offshore wind. The development in this sector is very rapid. The competition is really ramping up internationally. South Korea is getting good at this. The Brits and the Scots are getting good at this. France also wants to get into this market. So Norway needs to act fast.
Gentlemen, it'll be really interesting to see what direction Norway takes in the months and years to come. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Lars-Henrik Michelsen, Havard Halland, Espen Moe and Havard Halland, thank you very much indeed. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.